Hello again, and welcome to our second module here in our course in Foundations in Moral Theology. What we're going to be doing in this module is beginning to really dive into our Aquinas' Ethics textbook and walk through the first section of that, which really is the section of the book that lays the foundation for Aquinas' ethical system by talking about his larger theology, in particular looking at his understanding of kind of the hierarchy of being that makes up the universe, makes up reality, and then also looking at his understanding of the human person, and in particular the human person as a combination of body and soul, and the human person as possessing a range of different capacities that ultimately allow us to be and fully become what we were intended to be, namely the image of God. So here again in this second module, we're not going to get into anything too terribly difficult. Really what I want to just do here is make sure that these basic foundational ideas are clear and understood, in part because it's very important for then being able to understand all of the ethical principles and norms that are going to be developed from these foundations. And also because we'll talk about at the end of the module, really I think when we get down to many of the debates in our society today about all kinds of controversial issues, whether it be medical ethics or sexual ethics or economics, really anything, while there are certainly some places where we can disagree on details or we can disagree on whether or not people have reasoned through the issues properly, I think a lot of our most heated debates and disagreements in society are rooted in fundamental disagreements about the kinds of things that we're talking about here in this module. Namely, what is our basic understanding of the world around us? What is our basic understanding of the human person? So it's important that we be very clear on that from the Catholic and the Christian perspective, so that we can then explain it to others, and so that we can be clear in our own minds about how we might fundamentally disagree with those who are advancing positions that are contrary to the specific norms we'll talk about later, based on disagreements about the nature of the world around us and the human person. And one way I think to open that discussion is to really look at the question of what makes you happy, right? We often hear this in society today. People talk about, well, this makes me happy, that makes me happy. We all want to be happy. And as you have probably seen at this point from your textbook, Aquinas and the Christian tradition would certainly agree that we ought to be aiming for happiness. And I was trying to think of how to illustrate this for the module, so I just thought rather than try to pick all the kinds of different things that might make people happy, I would just pick a handful of the things that make me happy. And so you can see them here. I like keeping my chickens in the backyard. You'll hear more about them later on this semester when we talk about some of the ethics of food. But they're a lot of fun to sit there and watch them peck around and do their chicken things. Other things that make me happy probably come as no real surprise. If you've been on campus for some of the weekends, I'm usually downing some coffee, and I really enjoy coffee. And I'm admittedly a little bit of a coffee snob, which reduces the enjoyment sometimes, when you're getting the machine coffee. But on the whole, it certainly is something that adds to my overall happiness in life. I also find a lot of happiness in books, and in particular old books, and manage to find a way to at least partially make a living by reading and rummaging through old books. And so those are some of the things that make me happy. Now, of course, if this were a real classroom instead of a virtual one, we could go back and forth now and talk about, well, what are some of the things that make you happy, and what are some of the things that make you happy? And we could discuss that, and we might disagree and say, look, dusty old books and coffee and smelly chickens, none of these things really make people happy. But ultimately we would say, well, those things make me happy, but they may not work for you, and your things may not work for him or her, and so on and so forth. And we have this idea in society, and the way we discuss it is basically that, well, what makes people happy is going to vary from person to person. For me, it's coffee and old books. For you, it might be chocolate and walks on the beach, or whatever it might be. And there certainly is some truth to that, right? All of those things can make us happy to an extent. The problem is that in our culture, in our society, that's really kind of what we have reduced true happiness to. We've reduced it to these sort of temporary emotional states of happiness that we then associate with these different kind of instrumental causes, whether it's old books or coffee or what have you. And we've kind of lost sight of the idea that there can be this larger ultimate happiness, right? That there can in fact be, for lack of a better way of putting it, a capital H happiness, right? A true happiness. And not only is there in fact a true happiness that is not just kind of a fleeting emotion, but is a kind of solid state of being, if you will. It's also not the case that there are all kinds of different things that can give us that happiness, right? In fact, there is a relatively specific program, if you will, for reaching that sort of happiness. And that is not just up to, well, whatever you happen to like that will make you truly happy, right? To be truly happy, in fact, we have to live in accord with certain rules, certain ways of living. And this is where our society's views are going to start to come into conflict with the views that we are learning about from Aquinas here in our textbook. Right? Because Aquinas is ultimately going to say, when we're going to talk about true happiness, it's not the case that it's purely up to your preferences, purely up to your desires. In fact, he's going to say there's a particular way of being, a particular way of living that will make you truly happy. And if you don't care for that, if you don't like it, if you disagree with it, you can do that as a human person. But if you do that, you are in fact not going to be truly happy, whether you think you will or not. So when somebody around us talks about, well, this makes me happy, but not that, or that might work for you or not for me, yes, on one level that can be true, but on a more basic, more important level, Catholic ethics, natural law is going to say, no, there is in fact a right way to live in a way that will truly make us happy. So that's what we want to develop here in the remainder of the module and in the coming weeks in our course. One of the things that the textbook discusses in the introduction and then periodically throughout the book as a whole is the connection between Aquinas and Aristotle. Aristotle is one of the primary sources for Aquinas in developing really many of the different aspects of his thought, including his basic views of reality and the human person, as well as his ethical system that's based on that view of reality and the person. And the textbook talks a little bit about this, but I thought it would be helpful if any of you don't have a background in philosophy or ancient philosophy, it would be helpful to at least get a little kind of refresher introduction to who Aristotle was and what he thought, and in particular what he thought that's going to be relevant here for our discussion of Aquinas' view of the world and Aquinas' ethics. As you can see here, Aristotle is an ancient Greek philosopher. He was living and working in the 4th century BC, so well before the time of Christ, and certainly long before Aquinas. And again, you probably know, right? Aristotle is one of the students of Plato, but they fundamentally disagree on some important issues. And so Aristotle and Plato are typically seen as kind of the two main figures in classical philosophy. Aristotle is also famous for having been the tutor of Alexander the Great, at least for a time. It doesn't seem necessarily clear that all of the lessons really sunk in with young Alexander, because he certainly doesn't seem to embody at least some of the virtues that Aristotle talks about in his work. But Aristotle certainly is a very influential, important thinker in antiquity, but then also, again, very much when we get to the Middle Ages. And after Aristotle's death, his influence is not really terribly great in the ancient world. Platonism is much more influential. Stoicism is very influential. And Aristotle, his influence is rather limited. But after the rise of Christianity, collapse of the Roman Empire, the so-called Dark Ages, when we get up to the Middle Ages, when European civilization is beginning to rebound and flourish again, the early schoolmen, these early academics working in the universities and the cathedral schools, they rediscover Aristotle and find him immensely useful. And so he really has more influence 1,500 or so years after his death than he really did in the immediate generations after him. And when we read Aquinas, for example, when he refers to the philosopher, he's talking about Aristotle. So he really is the philosopher certainly for Thomas and for the scholastics in general. And why is he so important? Why does he differ so much from Plato, from his teacher? Well, he's important and useful because of his approach to philosophy, his approach to reasoning and living. And he really focuses on the particulars and experiencing the particulars. And so Plato, as many of you probably know, right, really focuses on ideas, on universal concepts. Right? So for Plato, the way to really go about thinking is to try to limit your contact with the physical world around you and really sort of focus yourself solely on an intellectual, abstract pursuit of the truth and of beauty. For Aristotle, he takes a very different approach. Right? He's going to say what we need to do to think properly and then to live properly is in fact to focus on all the particular things we see around us, the plants, the animals, the people, and by studying all of those particulars, that's how we will come to understand reality and then be able to live well in it. Right? So he's going to focus on a posteriori knowledge, that is, knowledge that comes after experience, after interaction with things, over and against Plato, who's really focuses on a priori knowledge, that is, kind of innate ideas that aren't based on experiences that we have. And Aquinas and the other scholastics are going to find this an appealing way of approaching the world. Right, so another thing that Aristotle does, based on his study of the particulars, is that he needs to develop a way of organizing and talking about all these particular things. And so Aristotle develops a very comprehensive approach to categorizing different beings. He really formulates the basic rules of logic and argumentation in his time. And so he comes up with some very useful systems for categorizing things and for reasoning through different categories and different ways of things relating to each other. And so he comes up with this whole hierarchy of different types of beings and categorizes men and women as rational animals. Right? And so this is an idea that's going to be picked up on and developed further by Aquinas. When we have these beings, these rational animals, right? Aristotle, in his Ethics, once he understands what kind of a creature a particular thing is, then he can ask the question of, well, okay, how should this thing live? What's the right way for this thing to live, right? And you can determine that by studying the creature, seeing how it functions, seeing how it's put together, seeing how it relates to the environment around it. And we can look at tigers, we can look at birds, we can look at whatever kind of being we might want, and we can see, well, what are the kinds of activities, what are the kinds of conditions that lead this thing to flourish, and what are the kinds of activities or conditions that lead these sorts of things to not do well and to degrade and ultimately even to die. And that can then give us guidelines for how these things ought to act, how they ought to live. And the same thing is true of human beings, right? So Aristotle is going to study the way human beings live, the way they interact with others, the kind of conditions that lead to their flourishing, and the kinds of conditions or actions that lead to them not doing well, right? And all of this is ultimately aimed at not just kind of writing books or abstract philosophizing. He really wants to be able to come up with a practical guide for how we ought to live and how we ought to live well. And given his approach to reality, what's going to constitute living well is going to be living well in accord with matching the sort of creature that we are, the sort of particular thing that we are. In our case, that is rational animals, right? And so this is going to mean that the right way for us to live is to have reason guide our animal natures, so that reason and the right use of reason is going to shape and control and guide our more basic animal instincts and desires. And that is really going to be the key to good living. And this will then help us make good choices and develop virtues, and to live according to the golden mean, right? And these are famous ideas in Aristotle's philosophy, and we'll come back to these as we get into some of the specifics of Aquinas' philosophy in the coming modules. But when we talk about the virtues, well, what does that mean? Well, Aristotle is one of the kind of primary original figures to really develop this idea of the virtues philosophically. And basically he argues that the virtues are essentially habits, that what we do is if a person is thinking about how to live and they make good choices, they make choices that are in accord with their nature and are going to help them flourish, and they make those choices over and over again, what's going to happen is you're going to develop a habit of living that way. And that habit, as a good habit, is he's going to term a virtue. It's something that helps you be a good person, a good rational animal. And in many cases, if not all cases, this is going to consist in acting accord to the golden mean. That is, in most situations in life, what we need to do is strike a balance between some of our passions and other passions, right? So, for example, when confronted with danger in battle, what is the virtuous way to act? The virtuous way is to be courageous, right? And courage is a golden mean, right? It's a good balance between cowardice on the one hand, which certain of our passions can lead us towards. On the other hand, we don't want to be foolhardy either, right? Which could be another conflicting passion. What we need to do is find the middle, find the rational, prudent balance between those two extremes, which is going to be the golden mean. And so, if we can act according to the golden mean, develop the virtues, what's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is ultimately we're going to succeed and flourish as human beings, as the kind of creatures we are, right? And Aristotle refers to this by the term eudaimonia, which is typically translated as happiness. But this is the kind of happiness we were talking about on the first page. That's a true happiness. That this is the kind of happiness that is not just an emotion. It is in fact a way of life, a way of being, where you are fulfilling your nature, where you are being all that a human being is intended to be. And for Aristotle, you reach that by acting in accord with your nature, developing these virtues, so that you can ultimately attain this true, fulfilling happiness, sometimes also referred to as flourishing. And that's our ultimate goal. So that's, in a really kind of brief nutshell, Aristotle's view of reality and ethics. And as you'll see, and as the textbook will talk about, this is going to be kind of the basic framework then for Aquinas' approach to these issues. Although Aquinas, as a Christian, many centuries later, is going to modify Aristotle in some important ways. But Aristotle's still going to be the foundation, and also it's helpful to understand Aristotle's approach because I think, as I mentioned in the first module, one of the benefits, I think, of natural law as an ethical system for Christians is that it's possible to reach a large amount of agreement with non-Christians if they're willing to accept the kinds of arguments, the kinds of ideas developed by Aristotle, which I think can be quite persuasive and convincing if we understand how to describe them. But to shift now a little more specifically to Aquinas' ethical system and how he builds on Aristotle, we'll go ahead and turn to the next page. One of the important ideas to understand about Aquinas' view of reality of the universe is this basic idea that he has of the relationship between being and goodness. And this certainly has connections with Aristotle and with ancient philosophy, but it also has important connections to a basic Christian understanding of reality, which is essentially rooted in the book of Genesis, right? That when God creates things, when he brings things into being, he says that they are good, right? And as Christians, we believe that whatever God makes is in fact good. And we reject the idea that was popular in many religions and in many ancient philosophies that certain types of material beings or material existence per se is somehow bad or corrupt. Right? So Aquinas is going to take it as a given that insofar as a thing exists, it is good, right? Because it only exists because God made it, and God's not going to make something that isn't good. Now, this is not to say, of course, that everything is equally good, right? There are going to be different degrees or a hierarchy of being. And this is an important idea to understand in Aquinas to be able to make sense of his ethical system as we get into the details of it. Right? And essentially, this is going to be connected to the idea of potentiality and actuality, or how fully alive, how much being does a being have, which is kind of a weird way to put it. We don't really use the kind of philosophical terminology that Aquinas would use on a day-to-day basis. But the idea is that if we equate being and goodness, right, God is pure being. God is, in fact, being itself, right? And as such, God is perfectly and wholly good. Now, other things have being and goodness to the extent that they are like God, right? And the further away they are from God, the less being, the less goodness they have, right? And the other end of the spectrum, as the textbook talks about, is so-called prime matter, which doesn't really even exist, right? It's more of a possibility. It's pure potentiality with no real existence, right? And then what happens is you can move up this ladder of things that have more and more existence, if you will, more and more being and goodness, right? Ranging from inanimate things like a hunk of granite up through things that have more and more likeness to God, moving into living things like plants or mushrooms, into animals, and then ultimately into human beings, and then into immaterial beings like angels, before we then ultimately get back to God. Right? And the basic idea here is that all of these things are good, and all of these things have their right place in the universe. But within each of these kind of strata, or each level of this hierarchy, what the things need to do, what makes them good men and women, or good tigers, or good mushrooms, is that they in fact fully realize their potential, right? That they be fully what they were intended by God to be, right? And this is going to basically mean that you are kind of pushing the upper limit, if you will, of your level here in the hierarchy, right? And insofar as you tend away from being fully what you could be, that's going to be a reduction in the fullness of your being, and therefore a loss of goodness, right? So, for example, if we focus on the human level here, right, what makes you a fully realized good human being is that you aim as much towards what is above the higher parts of your nature as possible, right? So that you live a life based on your ability to reason, based on your ability to contemplate and love and know God, and point yourself up on the hierarchy. Right? If you spend your life focused on the things below, on your bodily nature, on food and drink and bodily pleasures, that's going to be shifting your attention downward and away from what you could fully be, and it's going to make you not fully human, and you're going to miss out on much of the goodness that's possible for a human being given your nature. Right? So this hierarchy says that everything in its level is good, but if you deviate from that, especially if you aim down, that's going to be a loss of goodness, right? And this goes all the way back to St. Augustine with his idea, his understanding that there's no such thing as evil stuff, right? Evil doesn't exist. What does exist that we can call bad or evil is an absence of something good that ought to be there, right? So if a human being doesn't realize their potential, doesn't fulfill their nature, and instead reduces their nature to something below what it could be, that in fact is an evil. That in fact is a loss of the good. And so that's why this hierarchy is important. And I think some of the examples used in the textbook illustrate this pretty nicely, right? That a good knife is a knife that really does what knives were intended to do, namely cut things well. A knife that doesn't do that is a bad knife, right? And so human beings are like this. Human beings are meant to be rational animals, that is, to guide and direct their bodily life in accord with reason and knowing and loving higher things, primarily, of course, ultimately, God. Right, so in some ways, this hierarchy can seem kind of weird and antiquated, but I think those examples from the book can be helpful in explaining and understanding the idea here. Right, and of course, and the other thing to note here that's going to lead us into the next topic is that human beings occupy a unique position on this hierarchy, that they are the only creatures that combine intellect and will and reason with a bodily nature, right? That everything below human beings on the hierarchy lacks intellect and lacks will in the kind of rational sense. Everything above human beings is purely rational, purely spiritual, and lacks a bodily nature altogether. So human beings occupy this kind of central point, if you will, in the hierarchy of being, which on the one hand makes them very interesting and complicated and important, and on the other raises particular challenges for human beings as well in working out the right way to relate our immaterial and bodily natures. And so to talk a little bit about that, we will go ahead and move now to the next page. Okay, so I have to admit that this is one of the odder graphics that I've ever selected for a page in one of these modules. But it does have a point, which hopefully will become clear here in a moment. But if you remember from, about 10 seconds ago, depending on whether you got up for a sandwich between pages of the module here, human beings occupy this unique position in the hierarchy of being, of combining a rational nature with a bodily nature. And of course, this is the famous issue in philosophy and in religion in general of the problem of the body and the soul, or the body and the mind, right? And there seem to be these two components to human nature, to human life, and philosophers and theologians and thinkers throughout basically every era of human history have struggled with how to understand the connection between these two things. Now, in our society today, popularly rooted in modern philosophy, and in particular Descartes, but stretching back from Descartes all the way back to Plato, right, there is a dualism in our society, right, which basically sees the body and soul as two separate things, right? So, and this is not only limited to kind of the secular society, you also find this very often in the Christian world as well. And you'll hear many Christians talking about body and soul this way, that they are kind of two separate entities that may or may not work well together. Now, of course, there are also others who would argue that there is no such thing as a soul, that all we are is a body, which would be another position. But particularly within the Christian world and within popular culture, people have this idea of a spirit or a soul, but it's seen as separate, right? And many Christians, when they're talking about what happens after you die or what happens in eternity, will talk about themselves or human persons in this way, right? Where the body dies and then the soul goes to heaven and will be there in eternity with God. And if you were in the New Testament class, the Pauline epistles class, you've seen how N.T. Wright and others have argued against this view to say that it's not ultimately biblical, it's not ultimately part of the traditional Christian view, but it is very popular, right? And so the idea that many people hold is analogous, I would say, to this cowboy, right? That the body and soul are joined like the cowboy and the horse, right? Where the two work in tandem, they can work more or less well together, but they can also be separated. And in particular, the cowboy can get off the horse and go walk around and get in a pickup truck and still be the same cowboy, right? And in fact, the pickup truck might be better, right? And this is the idea that many Christians seem to work with is, well, yes, we have these bodies, but what we really are is the soul, and ultimately this body is going to die, and then the soul is going to go to heaven and just stay by itself, or maybe God will give us some new, better body, but it's really the soul who makes us who we are. It's the soul that really is the person. And again, you will encounter this, I would think, I've certainly encountered it, not just in kind of popular culture, but in many Christian students, many Christians in the parish who really have just kind of absorbed this from the larger culture. Now, Aquinas is going to argue something very different, rooted both in Aristotle and rooted in the Christian tradition. And that's a view of the human person and the body and the soul that's more in keeping here with the image of the centaur. Now, I'm not arguing for the historical reality of centaurs, but I think it's a helpful image to show this intimate, inseparable connection between body and soul, making up the one being, the one person. And if you take either part away, you don't really have something that can exist on its own, right? The two are intimately and completely connected. Now, of course, as the textbook is going to explain, it is possible for the soul to exist for a time apart from the body, right? And Christians believe this happens between death and the resurrection. But as Aquinas explains, it's only possible because God sustains the soul in a sort of special way until it can be reunited with the body. And even in the happiness of the blessed between death and resurrection, there is still something missing, right? And the happiness will be made complete when the soul is reunited with the body at the resurrection. Now this is an important thing to appreciate and to understand, and it becomes very important when we get to a lot of the ethical principles that we're going to talk about in the remainder of the class. Right? If we view the human person as primarily the soul and the body is just this sort of tool or this temporary housing, that's going to mean it's only the things that seem to directly affect the soul that ultimately matter. Right? And the things that just affect the body, not so important. Right? And obviously this is going to have connections with medical ethics, with sexual ethics, with economics, all sorts of things, right? Where, well, as long as we take care of our soul, what happens with the body is not such a big deal. And by extension, this is then going to affect our views of the physical world around us, right? That if bodily stuff isn't really important, what matters is our immaterial souls. Again, maybe how we care for the physical world, even less so than our particular bodies, it doesn't really matter, right? And so we don't need to care for animals or the environment or whatever it might be. But this is a non-Christian view of reality. This is a non-Christian, or at least non-traditional Christian view of the human person, right? That it is, as Aquinas will say, as the textbook points out, the body is in fact the person. Right? Now, this is not to say that the person is a bunch of bits of matter, right? As the textbook, I think, explains fairly well, right? When Aquinas says that, he's talking about the living body, right? That is the body that's animated and given coherence by the soul. That living body, this intimate connection of body and soul together, that is in fact the person. And so again, probably many of you know this, but I think it's an important point to emphasize here so that if you are then working with others, teaching classes, you can emphasize it there as well, because it really is shocking how little appreciated this traditional Christian view of body and soul is, even amongst cradle Catholics who've been attending religious schools and CCDs and Mass their whole lives. You'll still hear them talk about body and soul in this way. And it's only when we understand that intimate connection that a lot of the specific teachings about how we treat our bodies is ultimately going to make sense. So again, I apologize if I'm preaching to the choir here, but it really is a crucial point that's then going to shape a lot of the specific ethical rules and norms that we're going to talk about upcoming in the course. So then, this human person that's made up of the body and the soul, intimately united, connected to make up the person. Within that body and soul union, there is a range of different capacities, right? This goes back to that earlier page where we talked about this hierarchy of beings. And one of the ways to think about or organize that hierarchy is to look at, well, what are the different capacities that beings on different levels have, right? And so again, the textbook will talk about this, that you, if you have a nutritive capacity, that's going to place you higher than a chunk of wood, or, well, a chunk of wood is dead at that point, so it no longer has nutritive capacity. When it was part of a tree, it did. A rock never has that, right? And when you can add in sensory abilities, when you can add in the ability to move and so on, that as these capacities increase, your kind of place in the hierarchy increases correspondingly. Right? And again, human beings occupy this unique position in the middle, where they possess these bodily capacities, these animal capacities, as well as the higher rational capacities of intellect and will, which are shared by the angels and then ultimately and fully in God. And so, again, as a particular type of creature that has these capacities, what we ought to do, what makes us good human persons, is to fully realize all of these capacities, right? And so Aquinas' view of life and of the moral life is one of growth, one where we come to develop more and more fully all of these capacities. And in part, this is going to happen by the fact that as we grow, we in fact make new capacities available as we develop the ones below. So, for example, right, infants don't really have all of the capacities, say, that an adult would have, right? That you really need to develop and mature and realize some of those basic capacities for sensing and moving and some of the kind of practical uses of intellect to accomplish the basic things that we want, whether it's picking up a ball or putting a graham cracker in our mouth. You need to master those sorts of things before you really have the capacity to do the higher level things like reason and to know and love the good. And so this vision of the moral life is one of growth, it's one of progression, it's one of realizing more and more our capacities. And of course, this is really going to continue throughout life. It's not as if once we reach the adult stage, now we've arrived, right? That there continues to be a growth in realizing our capacities, in particular our intellect and our will in knowing and loving the good. So again, it's important to have this basic view of the moral life that Aquinas has. And again, this is very different than, say, some popular ideas, right? Which would say, well, the moral thing to do is just to enjoy yourself as much as you can, to have as much pleasure as you can, and make sure other people enjoy themselves as well. Now, there's nothing wrong with pleasure and enjoyment, but that's not what defines the human life or the moral life, right? What makes us moral and what we ought to do to become good persons is to grow and develop, and this is a continuous process. Right? This is also different, I would say, than some popular Christian ways of thinking about morality. Right? So in some Christian traditions, right, we are so sinful, we are so depraved, that they don't have really this idea of moral progression, or at least it's very much downplayed. Right? That really what we need to do is to acknowledge that we are sinners, and yes, we should be moral, but that's really going to primarily consist in not breaking certain rules like the Ten Commandments or what have you. And this idea of a moral progression where you can fulfill your capacities and become a better and better person is seen as misleading or even dangerous or unchristian, in that it places too much emphasis on our works and on our efforts. And of course, that's a debate we've discussed in the history of Christianity course and elsewhere, so we're not going to rehash that here. But Aquinas, following Aristotle and also following the larger Catholic tradition, has this different view, right, which is going to see the moral life as one of continual growth and progression and realizing our capacities. Now, this is also going to include the lower capacities, right? So, drawing on Aristotle, Aristotle's going to emphasize this much more, where Aquinas is going to emphasize more the theological virtues and the kind of capacities that those make available. But even Aquinas would say part of this is also going to be realizing our bodily capacities, right? That part of a good life is going to be maintaining bodily health. It's going to be maintaining the ability to move about and do the things that we want and need with a certain degree of ease and skill. And so it's going to include these higher capacities of knowing and loving God, but it also includes the other capacities that we have as bodily beings. And of course, the ultimate goal in all of this is to become more and more fully in the image of God, so that we can then be in communion with God in eternity, right? And again, I always bring out this icon of the Trinity when talking about this, because I think it's such a beautiful image of this ultimate goal, right? Of coming to the table, if you will, of the Trinity, being invited into the divine life, which of course one is only able to do if you have prepared yourself, with God's help of course, to enter into that, right? And that's the ultimate goal of this moral life, of the development of these capacities, is to be able to enter into that communion with God in eternity. And Aquinas, of course, takes Aristotle's idea of developing these human capacities with the goal of leading a flourishing natural life, and what he then does is extend it to add on this higher goal of ultimately attaining communion with God. And how that changes some of the moral norms and particular virtues, we'll talk about more as we get further into the book and the course. But this basic idea of moral progress and development is fundamental to both Aristotle and Aquinas. All right then, as I said at the beginning of the module, I don't imagine that any of this is terribly surprising if you've read through the textbook carefully. I wanted to make sure that I went over some of these basic ideas so that if there was some confusion in the textbook, that hopefully this would help clear up some of those issues. Because it is important to understand these foundational ideas if you're going to make sense of all the moral rules and principles that are going to be built on them. With that being said, though, I do think it is important to pause here at this point in the course and in this point in the textbook and really think about some of the questions raised by these ideas, by this understanding of the human person and the moral life. And one of the things I think that perhaps is at least something missing from this textbook, I think it does a very good job of explaining the basics of Aquinas' view of the world and the human person and ethics. But by that focus on Aquinas, it can also make things very abstract, if you will, right? And so, yes, it's good to talk about realizing our human nature, being a good rational animal, utilizing and developing our different capacities. But it's probably difficult, or at least you could imagine it would be difficult, to imagine how does that translate into real living, right? What is it to be a human person who is living well? What does it look like? What does it mean to know and love God, right? Or another question that could be raised, I think, connected with this is, in Aquinas we get this hierarchy of capacities to match the hierarchy of being, and right, the ultimate capacity, our ultimate goal in life, ought to be knowing and loving God, and really reflecting on, thinking about being itself, right, and desiring that and loving that. And yes, that all sounds really wonderful when we're reading our graduate course textbook. But what does that mean in terms of concrete living? And is it really the case that contemplating being itself and loving that, is that really the highest activity for the human person? Now, we could argue certainly that it is, and if you're in graduate school, you probably do have a certain desire for contemplating reality, contemplating ideas like that. But I think we could imagine there could be many people who would not see that as the ideal kind of pinnacle of existence, if you will, and would see that sort of intellectual contemplation as not only not the highest, but not even something that was terribly attractive. So I think it's helpful at least to think about, does that really seem true, or do we need to kind of broaden our understanding of what it means to know and love God, so that it's not purely an intellectual kind of academic pursuit, but includes ways of living that are ways of knowing God and loving God. And again, I don't necessarily have the answer to this, but it does still, or at least seems possible to me, that someone could object to that idea as being kind of the pinnacle of human existence. There is this other question still, I think, too, of what would this sort of life that Aquinas is laying out here look like in concrete details? Now, one of the things we'll look at in the coming modules are some of the more modern developments in natural law, which could be helpful in maybe giving a little meat to this picture of human life. And in particular, this idea of some basic goods that make up a human life that's lived well. And so I think that list of basic goods of things like health and friendship and peace of conscience and peace with God, leisure and play. If we can add some of those components, maybe that will flesh out this image of living well and fully as a human person. Another question I think that often does come up in class, and it could certainly come up when you were discussing these ideas as well, is many people would object to the idea that there really is human nature. Right? All of this discussion is rooted in the idea that we can talk about, well, this is what it is to be a human being. You're on this level of the hierarchy. You have these capacities. And many people today reject this idea and would argue that human nature is just a construct, and that we can shape human nature however we will, and that it varies from place to place and from time to time. And really, there's no kind of quick and easy way to address that objection. Part of what natural law is built on is a kind of a wide-ranging understanding and study of human life and human people. And it just tends to be the fact, I think, that there are certain qualities that remain true across different cultures, across different periods. People who pursue, for example, material goods and wealth at the expense of family or friendship, you could say, well, in some cultures, wealth is much more valued than in others. But it seems fairly universal in human experience that those people are not seen as living good lives. They are seen as not being truly happy. That it's not the case that you can decide money is more important to you than relationships and make that true for yourself. You can tell yourself it's true, but human experience throughout a whole host of cultures has shown us time and again that that is in fact not a good way to live. And so I think it's only by emphasizing those commonalities, and that can be a kind of long, grueling process to build that sort of argument, but I think it can in fact show that even if we don't accept the idea of some sort of abstract metaphysical human nature, we can see that there are in fact certain ways of living that seem to fit human beings better than others. And so at least there's something like a human nature that really is out there, if you will. Now, if you follow up on this, there's another question of, well, couldn't we change our nature, right? Especially now as we have the possibility of genetic manipulation or cybernetic implants or who knows what it might be. Maybe we could change our nature, and then that would lead to different actions being in accord with our nature. Right, of course, we can already see this in some areas like medical ethics and sexual ethics, right? In the last generation or two, we've succeeded, largely at least, in separating reproduction from sexuality. And that, many people would argue, look, yes, it used to be the case that sex was only right within marriage because sex usually entailed having a real possibility of having children. And it would be bad for the children not to have the family environment. So yeah, back in the day we can see that. But nowadays we don't need those rules because we have birth control. And so this is another connected issue that is often going to come up. Now, as we go forward in the class, we will talk about this in more detail. But what Aquinas would say, what Aristotle would say, what natural law says is that, in fact, we are the way we are for a reason, right? That if you, in fact, change human nature, bad things are going to happen, right? And again, making this argument largely consists of looking at specific details, right? Saying, well, yes, this has been tried, but let's look at the results. Are people really happier? Can you really get flourishing, happy lives from changing the nature of sexuality in this way? And in fact, showing no, ultimately it doesn't work. And this is where we then, I think, ultimately come up upon kind of the real issue, right? And that this whole vision of the human person, of the world that we've been spelling out in this module, and that's spelled out in the textbook, really confronts people with the reality that there is, in fact, a reality out there, right? That there is a structure, there is a plan that defines the world around us and defines, at least to some extent, our role in it, right? It's going to say, you are a human person in this type of world. To live well, you need to live within these standards, right? Of course, we can still make lots of choices, but there are going to be certain principles that we're going to have to follow to live well as human persons. Right? And this is where kind of the rubber meets the road, if you will. Right? This is where many people in society want to say no. Right? That I can define what makes me happy. I can define how I ought to live. I'm not bound by anything higher than myself. And ultimately, fundamentally, natural law is going to say no, right? That there are laws, there are realities to human nature in the world that mean we have to live in certain ways. And getting people to accept that idea, that is really kind of the ultimate hurdle, the ultimate challenge. But you have to accept that idea to then accept all of the particular norms and rules and principles that we're going to be spelling out in the remainder of the textbook and in the course as we move forward. Anyways, those are some of the issues I think that are raised by this view of the human person, by this view of the world. So I will ask a couple questions of you on Blackboard, maybe some of the ones here on the page, and then of course feel free to raise your own questions and we can talk this over virtually in the coming days.